A lot of times people are wanting, organizations, teams, individuals are wanting a breakthrough. They're wanting to get past all the obstacles, but it's several barriers in their lives that keep them sidelined, keep them from moving forward. And if anybody had a lot of barriers to having a truly changed life, it was Zacchaeus. First of all, he was a wretched crook. In verse 2, it says, there's a phrase here that says he was the chief tax collector. This is the only time in the New Testament we see that particular designation. The chief tax collector. Now, all you can assume from the meaning of that word is that all the tax collectors reported to him. In other words, he was the kingpin of the tax cartel in Jericho. And they were, as we know, assigned the role of getting taxes for Rome. They could charge whatever they wished over the top, pocket the rest. And you would imagine that the chief tax collector not only built out of the people, but from his fellow under hireling tax collectors. So he got there by being basically probably more corrupt than anyone else. But there was a burden to bear with being that corrupt, because he made his fortunes and his millions on the backs of preying on his own people. You might feel accomplished if you were really good at it, but you can't feel much peace at night when you go to bed or when you look at yourself in the mirror. You can't feel really good about yourself. When you go out in public, you probably can just sense the disdain that everybody has for you. Well, you also read in verse 2 that not only was he the chief tax collector, but he was wealthy. That's probably the understatement of the year, that he was wealthy. And he wanted to see Jesus, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. Do you think anybody who sees little Zach going through the crowd to get to Jesus is going to say, oh, there's a chief tax collector, come on through? No, they're not making way for him. They were probably holding their feet back from kicking him or tripping him. And so he had the barrier of being a crook, the barrier of being hated, the barrier of having so much wealth that he had no apparent needs at all. Those are things that can keep us from Christ. But he had another barrier that sometimes people don't do anything about, and that is an inner brooding emptiness, sort of a real lack of purpose that had to be hanging over his head. So much so that he did something that was unheard of. First of all, he ran ahead. And first century men didn't run. Running was something kids would do. And then it says he climbed a sycamore fig tree. Once again, not something a dignified politician would do. You don't run, you don't climb trees. But he was out of options. He knew that nobody was going to introduce him to Jesus. He knew that he couldn't see Jesus. He didn't think Jesus could see him. And so his emptiness was being used of God to create sort of an inner compulsion to long to meet Christ. And maybe some of you can look back in your life and remember that day when you began desiring God. It wasn't because you're smart enough to figure out that Jesus is God, and it's not because you can push a button somewhere and all of a sudden create desire in your heart. It is because God began doing surgery on your soul, began working in you an uneasiness that wouldn't be satisfied anymore with stuff, with whatever you had accomplished. And that's what was going on in Zacchaeus' life. He had barriers, but he was now, by the grace of God, beginning to see past them. And Jesus was coming that way, and he was ready to meet him. Now, we don't read anywhere in the first 4 verses that he had a sign that said, Jesus, look up here. We don't see anywhere that he was waving his arms or calling out. He'd made enough of a scene by climbing, but he didn't initiate contact with Christ. Why? Because Jesus is about to initiate a relationship with him. We read in verse 5 and 6, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now, it's a powerful principle there in verses 5 and 6 that we don't want to miss. It's number 2 on your outline today. And it's simply this, that a truly changed life gladly responds to Christ's initiative. Remember in 1 John, it says, we love because he first loved us. Jesus reminds us in John 15:16, remember, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. Jesus starts the process and we respond to his initiative. Now, why is it he starts the process? It's because that we're dead in our sin. We're passed out because of the blindness of our own wickedness. We couldn't save ourselves if we wanted to. But Christ's love is greater than our sin. His love and power is greater than our resistance. And we see it powerfully illustrated in this story when he first of all looks up and calls Zacchaeus by name and says, Zacchaeus. We might ask the question, how do you know his name? I mean, he could have learned his name as Christ is speaking with some of the town dignitaries and they tell him about all the politicians, all the criminals. His name would have come up in either one of those two categories. But I mean, he knew his name the same way he knew what the woman at the well in John chapter 4 had done, what her lifestyle was. He could see past people, and as much as there may have been some self-imposed limitations that Christ had in his humanity, he maintained the ability to know so many things. And I want you to know this morning that you may have climbed up your own sycamore tree, so to speak, trying to get God's attention. And I want you to know this morning that, first of all, he sees you. And secondly, he knows your name. He does. He knows what you're going through. Some of you are going, well, if he knows what I'm going through, why am I still going through it? Well, we don't have every answer to those kinds of questions, but if you would come to know him, you could have a broader perspective to handle the challenges that come your way. Here's the thing. Jesus knew Zacchaeus, but Zacchaeus did not know him. Jesus knows you, but unless you've turned from your sin and placed your faith in him, you may know things about him, but you don't know him, even though he knows you.